Greetings, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Narrative: The Road to 100 with Black AI Media. I am Cedric Scott Jr., your host, and we have an amazing guest, as always. But in this situation, it's nice because we're going to be digging into something a little bit more familiar to me in terms of education, but the importance of understanding how technology influences that, and also really tapping into what we are doing communal wise in terms of building in the space. So we have Shadeira Nesmith here, and we are going to get into the work that she's doing in terms of software and curriculum development. But I want to go ahead and just open up the space for you, Shadeira, and give us a quick intro. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes. So I'm Shadeira. So I've been in the EdTech space for about 8 years now. I started off with, because people always ask me, like, what is your journey into tech? How did you get into tech? Or how did you even get into like the teaching education space of it? So I went to college. In college, I minored in information technologies. So I was able to kind of get a little bit of insight of what tech was like. I didn't really take the classes of like software development. So it wasn't the traditional route of like a computer science student or anything like that, but it was kind of like just studying hardware and software. And then I also was a communications major. So usually within communications, if anybody has taken communication classes, it's very performative. So you have to like always speak about something. You're on radio, you're on TV. And that was new to me because I was a very shy person. So to have to be able to kind of speak and kind of be on camera and be on TV or radio was kind of a lot for me. So I think during that time, I was like, I don't know, but I was like, these classes are really easy and I want to graduate. So I was like, but I need also a media that's kind of like a growing field. So that's why I picked up my IT minor. And that was probably like my third year in college that I picked it up. So I picked it up pretty late. And then from there, I was like, okay, what can I do with this? How can I expand on it? I mean, I think there's so many opportunities now within the tech space for undergrads. So many. Every time I'm like on LinkedIn, it's like college student, Microsoft, Google, all of these things. But when I was in school, that wasn't available so much. So it was like, how do I kind of grow in this space? So my first interaction with tech and education was with Black Girls Code. They usually had workshops where they would run workshops for Black young girls ages, I would say like 8 to like 16, 18. And they would teach them how to build mobile apps, how to kind of build websites. And that was my first interaction. I was able to kind of work with them for about 3 years, just being a volunteer, working with the curriculum and different things like that. So that's kind of how I got into that space. And I was like, I really enjoy this. And I told people all the time, I was like, they'd be like, oh, what do you want to do and different things. And I was like, I'll do any job, but ever be a teacher. So it's so funny that I'm in this space of education and I love it so much because the impact that it has on so many students, especially me teaching something that's not so traditional or just something that's really of a higher level is like really important to me. So I've been doing that for 8 years. I started off with that first experience. Then from there, I started with younger kids. So I was working with students as young as like 4 years old. We were doing robotics, we were doing Scratch, block coding and different things like that. From that space, I moved into the high school level where I was working with more about like wearable tech. And I got the opportunity to also work with Girls Who Code, where they did like a lot of programs where students were able to kind of create things from code that they could like wear. And then from there, I went into as a full-time high school teacher. And that's how I got into like deep development of curriculum, building curriculum for a whole entire mobile app design class. And then I was like, high school was kind of really hard for me working with the students, also focusing on behavior. And it was hard to make an impact within the tech space as much as I wanted to for people to learn how to do tech teaching high school, because it was like, okay, make sure they're not, talking, or make sure they're not doing this, but also teach them how to, do this. So it was like really hard to do that for me. So that's when I transitioned into adult learning. So I currently work as a software development instructor, teaching adults full stack development tracks where they are able to kind of go into full-time roles as software developers after they finish the programs that I work with.
And there's one component that I want to dive a little bit further into before we talk about Stacked Up Academy and all the great work that
Mhm.
you're doing and support there. The aspect of women, particularly black women, young black women, right? We'll say black girls in terms of going into more of the STEM technology related kind of career pathways and trajectories. We have, of course, heard and kind of seen a lot of the metrics and conversations around how we can support young women getting into these spaces and just like the disparity. And we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there is something to that. And I've had conversations with a lot of people, especially in the education ed tech space, but even on some of these conversations for the Road to 100, where there is a recognition of that and realizing that we have more work to do there. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact and the importance that you saw and your experience there and how you saw that actually having an impact with regard to that growth of seeing our girls going into these spaces?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, especially within the spaces of a lot of these programs that do focus on girls specifically, or even I currently work for a company in Europe. It's called Coding Black Females, where we also focus on Black women who are older getting into that tech space as well. But I would say it's definitely something that most people don't have the opportunity to kind of go into unless they are exposed to those spaces. When I first started with Black Girls Code, a lot of the students that were in there, their mothers were also in tech. So their mothers probably worked like corporate at Verizon and different things like that. So they had their mothers who were Black women already in those higher spaces. It was very few women that who daughters, their mothers weren't like kind of like in that corporate space or diving into something like that. So I think over time it did grow where more people of maybe like a middle or lower class were able to find out like, oh, this is a program I can put my child in. And that's kind of the difference, especially working with so many programs within coding. With Girls Who Code, it's kind of like a different aspect because it was very more so diverse with the students that we were working with. And a lot of the students were all at different levels. So mom in corporate, mom not in corporate, maybe don't even have a mom or whatever the case may be. They were more so able to outreach a wider dynamic of students to kind of like, hey, we think this would be a really good program. And then also what Girls Who Coach do, they go to schools and they have people that can be ambassadors within a school space and do like an after school program with their programs and different things like that. So that was really something that was able to kind of get those people within those tech spaces. And what I do also notice is that it's really, unless you, it's like something like if you know, you know, and if you're looking for it, because a lot of these things aren't promoted or talked about. And I mean, especially now, I don't really know as far as like how people promote coding or people promote technology in school. But when I first started, there weren't any coding jobs to be a computer science teacher. It took about 3 years out of college where I started to see computer science teacher jobs as full-time jobs and not just like a part-time situation. So now, back then, when that was the case, like a lot of students didn't know about tech or even wanted to do tech. I was working at a school in Brooklyn with young girls, and they were just like, okay, like whatever, like I don't want to do this. Like it was something that was once they couldn't get it, they didn't want to do it anymore. So also just understanding how important it was to learn it was something that was also lacking within that space because I don't think they understand the importance of tech into right now, like how important it is within education overall.
And it's definitely something that we have to continuously have the conversations about and make sure that there is space being created. And I know that there are different organizations and groups, whether that's for educational purposes for girls at whatever level in their education, but then also for women, as you mentioned as well.
Mhm.
But I always just want to take space to always make sure we highlight and talk about that as something that we can look into growing into the future. I want to talk about Stacked Up Academy and what you're doing, what you've produced, and we'll get into some of the, I guess, the depth of that work. But can you first just kind of give us a little bit of an introduction to what it is, and also just kind of what was your motivation behind launching Stacked Up Academy?
Yeah, so I found it. So Stack Up Academy was kind of like a journey into. It took a while to start because it was a lot of like conversation around it, like how would this look, what would this be. So Stacked Up Academy, just to introduce it, it is a educational company that is teaching coding, finance, and graphic design, or just any design skills overall for students as young as 3 years old. So, kind of introducing technology as soon as possible and having our audience, which would be someone as young as 3, be able to learn these skills or just understand these keywords before they even get to high school. So that was the main goal of Stacked Up, is like, how can we get more students to learn about technology, not just in school, but outside of school? What tools can we provide? What resources can we provide where they can learn it at home, where they can learn it, just on the go or different things like that. So for me, my vision behind Stacked Up, when I first was thinking about it, I had so many different names for it. It was really about trying to understand, what can I provide that's different? What can I provide that's still going to give the same effect and impact that it does within this computer science space, and also still be able to help and just help people understand and make people want to kind of buy into it or really, learn more about it. So I would say in 2018, it was a thought. And especially working with all these programs, I tell people all the time, they're like, oh, you teach code, you should work for, I'm like, I work there. They're like, oh, well, I'm like, I work there. I'm like, I've worked for every coding company you could think about, especially within kids, especially in New York City. I've dived into all of them, whether it was seasonal, whether it was part-time, full-time. I've dived into, and if I haven't, I've interviewed with them. So I'm like, I know all these spaces, and I've learned so much about these spaces and what they're trying to curate with these with this educational space and within technology. During my time, I'm like, I want to have something for myself as well. But a lot of these companies, they're just teaching, they're not providing resources. So I was like, I want to have something where I can have something tangible as far as a product. So I remember I was on Twitter one day, and I was just scrolling through Twitter, and a friend I went to high school with, she tweeted something about like, I want to start a company teaching young kids about finance, and giving them tools like coloring books and flashcards and different things. I was like, oh, that would be interesting to collaborate with technology and finance, and especially finance is a whole nother level. Financial literacy is a whole nother level of how much it's not within the education, especially at a young age. Even in college, you don't learn financial literacy skills until you are adult and have to manage money. So that was something that was kind of like really important. So I messaged her. I was like, we should like, collaborate. And that was the start of Stacked Up Academy. And that's where the name also comes from. If you look at the logo, it's money. And then the money is being held up by a curly brace, which is curly brace within coding. And then if you see, we have play money and then we have real money. And that's where the design aspect came in. So we also brought in a graphic designer and was like, hey, we should teach design skills as well. So the play money is a graphic design, as if you're designing something as an animation or anything like that. So that's how we came up with like Stacked Up. You're stacking up as far as the money part and things like that. So yeah, so that's what we were kind of doing. We first started, so we launched in 2021. So we're still growing. We're still kind of understanding what would be best. How can we kind of connect with those audience, especially the parents of the young kids that we want to connect with. So we started with flashcards, and within the flashcards, we basically introduce what those terms are within each sector or pillar that we have. So it's like financial terms that you want to learn about, HTML, like things like that that you would want to learn about. And for the design, we have like a Photoshop stack where you can learn all the tools on Photoshop. So that's kind of where we started. And then we're kind of in a space now where we're like, we need something a little bit more tangible, because once they take these flashcards, they learn these words, but then what do they do with these words? How do they use these words? So right now we're in the process of kind of niching it down and making an ABC book for kids as young as 3, and taking those words that we use and turning it into A through Z, and seeing like, hey, can your 3-year-old recite the word app? And do they understand what an app is? Do they take the phone and like, this is an app? So that's how we want to do. And especially with money, if they take a money, this is $1. So kind of doing those type of things like that.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, definitely, I see it. Right. Stack your money, stack your skills, right? Stack your creativity
Yeah.
within the design. So extremely important, because you're infusing things that might not necessarily like traditionally be put together. Which,
Mm-hmm.
if we talk about children, which I'm really excited to hear about this, because I have a 4-year-old son, and I was like,
Oh,
oh,
awesome.
so yeah, I mean, we
Yeah.
gotta definitely dig into that, because it is really important, as I'm kind of watching him grow, develop,
Mm-hmm.
and learn. some of the things that you're talking about are definitely considerations that I'm looking at. I talked to my wife about, and so thinking about those things, was there a defining moment, a specific instance, or something that happened where you said, you know what, I can do more? And is there a certain time where you realized the potential impact of your work in the space and regarding tech?
I don't remember the exact moment that I came up with, like, okay, I want to do something that's teaching kids how to code. But before Stacked Up, I had another company, web design agency called Final Draft. And that was the first company I started that probably in 2000 and like 18, 17. And I was building websites. So taking clients, building a website for people that have businesses, and that was something that was kind of really something I really enjoyed, like just being on that creative side of things. And for me, when I first started within the tech space, I was really, and I'm still in my learning skills of learning how to code, because a lot of things are still not clicking to me most times. And they're like, oh, you teach? I'm like, yes, because I'm still learning why I teach as well. So it's really helpful for me to teach because I'm able to learn and teach at the same time. So I was like, what is something I can start that doesn't involve me coding, but I can still have something that like involves code, which would be building a website. So I started the Final Draft agency, and I was able to work through that. And then I was like, okay, I want to teach though. I want to teach something because I've been teaching, but I want to teach something within this aspect. So I kind of started to try to dive into teaching people how to do web design. Oh, you can build websites like this instead of having me build it. You can like kind of do this. And then I was like, okay, these skills are good and they're great. A web designer, that's a great position to have. But I was like, I want people to be able to dive in and really take on these technology jobs that involve skills that are coding, non-coding, but also coding. And I think that being in Final Draft, that's kind of what clicked, like, okay, I want to start something for kids because I build websites for mainly adults. So what can I do that also impacts kids as well? And I wanted to do a sector under Final Draft for kids, but I was like, I don't know. I don't want to mix it too much. But so it was kind of like a waiting moment. So I think like I said, when I saw her tweet that on Twitter, it was like, because it was so many coding companies already. So it's like what can I do differently? And then when I saw that, that's what really kind of sparked my like moment, like, hey, wait, this might be something that's different. And a lot of companies also do have finance companies for kids, but I think what makes us stand out is our sector within design. So it's three of us on the team, it's three co-founders. We have our financial person, we have our graphic designer. So we all are working together within our prospective fields of work to kind of create this together. So it was like now we have the design aspect to the coding and finance, which does get taught to students, but the design skills don't get taught as often. So now we're collaborating with all three of those, and that's kind of what differentiates us from like building such a better product.
And that actually kind of leads, I think, a little bit into my next question, which is more so related, not necessarily to structure of your team or anything like that, but just that factor of being able to separate yourself and delineate with what you've produced, was stacked up. I'm curious if just even in your transition to getting started up until this point, building out the team, creating the systems, the products, have you come across any unique challenges as you're building out Stacked Up? And I guess how did you overcome those?
I would say a challenge was how to get people to understand what we're doing and find the importance in it for their kids. Because a lot of times you do have adults who are transitioning into technology, and they'll buy into like a boot camp, they'll buy into like certain things, and they might have kids, but their first initial thought is not like, oh, I should get my kids started within technology or anything like that. So I believe our main challenge is like, how do we make people understand like this is like really important? Like it's not like we're not trying to really sell you anything to be like, oh, we want to make so much money and different things like that. We just see that, and I've done like research on like how many people know these things, or like, do you know what this word means? And even what's crazy, when we all built out our stacks, like I'm working with my HTML, like we don't know anything about anybody's else profession. Like the finance stack, I go over it myself. I'm like, I've never heard this word, and it's so sad because it's so many years. I'm like 8 years out of college and I don't know some of these terms. So for me, it's just really important to just get that early stage learning as soon as possible, just to really help our community overall. Me being African American, and my two co-founders are Hispanic, so we know how it is to be a minority within this space and having, not the access to a lot of these things. And I was telling them one day I was on the plane, and it was a family behind me, like a dad and two of his kids. He was reciting like financial terms, and they were giving him the definition. So he was like asset, and they like an asset is that. I turned back and I'm like, what is it? And, it was a white family. And I'm like, that doesn't happen for a lot of Black, Hispanic, minority families. So I was like, how can we get that in our spaces as well? So that was something that also just was like, okay, we have to really have people learn about this as soon as possible. So I would say that's our challenge. And we're trying to overcome it by niching it down as much as possible. So making it so small that's like you who doesn't want to buy an ABC book for a kid? All they have to do is like they could just open the book, play with it. As soon as they're able to read, they can read it. So that's something that we're trying to overcome by saying, how can we really niche this down to make it easier, not only for the kids, but for the parents as well? Because the stack that we have with the flashcards, it can kind of be overwhelming. Then it's like, okay, what do I do with this? But then an ABC book is like kind of like self-explanatory. So yeah.
Yeah, and it is an interesting point to make about our interactions in terms of families and how we introduce things with to our children and when that happens. And again, thinking about being a father and learning, right, alongside your child, and then being able to also transfer some of that information, which I think is what with what you're doing in terms of teaching while learning, right? Really exemplifying that lifelong learner aspect that we always talk about, it, as educators, is really important.
Yeah.
And within that, I think thinking about the I think the contribution that you're aiming to see with Stacked Up, right?
Mhm.
Because within this platform, we're talking about, of course, considering within our local communities and in our regionally, but even thinking about potentially like globally, internationally. What are your thoughts and feelings about what you're producing as it relates to connections to communities beyond even the U.S. And looking into the world? Do you see Stacked Up being kind of something that is implemented in different parts of the world, and has that been a conversation for you?
Yes, yes, that's a great question. I would say no, we haven't talked about that space as of yet. What we have talked about is also going into, because a lot of times when I mention stacked up to people, it's still in a stage where it's like I feel like we're premature. But I try to mention it like, hey, this is stacked up, and and then people are like, oh, I have a kid, I want them to learn how to code, and da, da, da. And that starts the conversation. So I kind of do it. It's kind of like interviews for me when I mention stacked up, to see the reaction that I get back. And then I take that information and I go to my co-founders like, I just had a conversation with someone and they said this, and they're like, okay. So then we brainstorm from those conversations that I have, because I recently started to go to a lot of more tech events than I have in the past, and I'm having those conversations in those spaces, and people are coming to me telling me about their kids that they want. I want my kid to learn how to build a mobile app. I want my kid to know how to do this. So that's kind of the spark of where I'm like, okay, how can we grow this at a larger scale? So we had conversations about creating like workshops that we can kind of do, like a workshop every month or so, where we're teaching those skills within our three pillars, and then people can join in and kind of learn about that more. So that can be from the U.S. to outside of the U.S. as well, like whoever wants to join. So that's one sector of it. And then another point of it is creating curriculum. So building out curriculums that we can sell to schools, and kind of customizing those curriculums depending on what school that is, and kind of selling that and showing people like, hey, you can kind of teach this here, you can teach this there. So anybody can buy the curriculum. It's not something that we're like, holding hostage or anything, but it's like, hey, if you are someone that is of a higher, within your school community, how would you like to have stacked up? We can customize a curriculum, especially for, for your school within financial literacy, within coding or anything like that. So that's kind of the next steps that we're taking into kind of getting it into a wider space, or just more people introduced to it, or rather than just being like a product based company, but actually like an educational company where we're able to kind of really impact with our skills of what we're teaching.
Yeah, and I think that definitely is a powerful point to be made, because just thinking about you and your co-founders, the amount of experience and expertise in those three different facets is I mean, that's immense. Like that, to have it all in one place too is unheard of in my experience. And I've been working in EdTech for a while
Yeah.
and been in education. I definitely think that there's something really to that. And I appreciate even just your consideration around thinking about, what can we do in terms of creating the alphabet book to make sure that the information is getting out there, and really taking the time to consider the end user or end, purchaser of that, which, yeah, I think is really impactful, especially as I think about like the homeschool community, for example,
Yes.
and implementation for different product strategies and resources and tools there. So much needed for sure. And I wanted to scale back just a little bit, because you did walk us through, kind of your personal journey into technology, but I wanted to go a little bit more into that, and think about how has your personal journey and experience, whether that be, growing up, or when you got to college, or whatever the case was, along that pathway, how has that journey shaped the way that you approach the work that you're doing?
Awesome. Yes. Great question. Yeah. I would say it shapes it 100%. And I would say this because I'm in these spaces now, and I'm like, I don't know why it took me so long to start going to tech events or just applying to like be do speaking engagements or anything like that. I saw that a lot of people are talking about, a lot of conversations I have, or a lot of companies that I've worked for, and I ask them like, what is the end goal? Like, what do you want to do with, these companies? And they say, I want to get more Black people into tech. I want to see more faces like mine. I want to see more, people like me being in these higher spaces. And for me, I understand it completely. I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I get that. And it's sometimes a disconnect for me, because when I'm in those spaces, I'm like, I see Black and brown people. I see, especially sometimes in education, it's like I see those people, and I start to realize more and more that there aren't those people there. I just think I see them because of how I grew up. And I grew up being one of the only in a lot of my classes, being the only Black girl, being the only, person just of color in general. So for me, when I'm around people that are not of color, I don't feel out of place because that's how I grew up. So sometimes I'm like, there are Black people. If I see one other Black person, they're like, no, we need 5 to 5. We don't need 2 to 10. So for me, that's my like me going into this space now and understanding and having those conversations. Like, okay, I see what it means when people say that now. And I'm starting to understand, and I'm looking around, and I'm able to see that now, based off of, and not basing it off the way that I grew up or how I saw diversity growing up. So I think for me, that's like super important, especially even with Stacked Up, or just even talking to other people, even adults, and I tell them what I do, and they're like, oh, you teach. And it's so, my title is so funny to me because it's like I try to say it and I feel like it's so long. So I'm like, they're like, what do you do? And I'm like, software development. And they think I'm like just an engineer. And I'm like, software development instructor. Like, I have to like hound in on the instructor part, because it's like, I'm not a software developer. So I think also having those conversations, and they're like, oh, I want to learn how to code, or I've been trying to transition. Like, how can you help? And that's also another part for me. Like, how can I help those people that do want to get into that, outside of the teaching for organizations that I do? Like, can I go outside of that, and how can I apply that so that people do get in those spaces, or even just be able to like not even just sit in those spaces, but just be a part of those communities overall.
And I'm interested to know also, with regard to your journey, and where you are now, as you're moving into these spaces and having those realizations, and and hearing from other people, the feedback, the stories, the just the shares. I'm curious, what values do you personally kind of carry into the work that you're doing that might stem from when you were younger, in your personal experiences?
Mhm. I would say the values definitely have an empathy. I think a lot of times within a space, the space that I am and now with education, as far as the ed tech space and teaching adults how to code that have never coded before is a totally different sector. And it it makes me realize that I think I tell people this all the time. Everyone learns the same way. So I can teach and I use AI every day. So I try to use AI in a way to like, how can I teach this technical term to someone that's 5 and someone that's, 30, and I'm like, "Hey, this is how you explain this," and they get it right away because I tried to transition it to a 5-year-old teaching and it still makes sense to somebody that's 30 who's never coded before, opposed to a technical term and you try to get really technical and they're like, I don't understand that. How can you break this down? So breaking down that for people of the age and not expecting them to know it within a technical level because they're older. So I think having that empathy has really helped me as an educator understand that everyone is not going to be able to learn at an advanced level no matter what age they are. So being able to break down things as young as 5 or like, at a 6th grade level for people that are older so they are able to advance and understand like, okay, I get that now I can work with that because that makes more sense to me. So I think that's definitely something that I use throughout my career.
Awesome. And you mentioned too, just thinking about kind of the future, particularly what you're building with Stacked Up,
Mhm.
and just professionally for yourself. I'm curious to know because I know we talked about the alphabet book, which is kind of like
Mhm.
next phase, next focal point. Beyond that, can you tell us if there are any other potential developments that you're maybe looking at, or what's next for Stacked Up?
So also I think when you asked about like internationally as well, I think what we have tried to do too, being that the co-founders are Hispanic, we've tried to like transition things into, the Spanish vocabulary as well, trying to do things like that. Like, okay, let's make this Spanish. And I have both of my one of them, her daughter, she talks to her in Spanish and English. The daughter talks back in Spanish and English, and she's 2. So she can like understand both as well. So also having that sector is something that we plan to do, like transitioning these things into different languages is something also on the radar. But for me, myself, something that I also want to get into is seeing how I can create something for adult learning. So it's kind of been in our beginning stages, we were like, oh, we had a lot of adults coming to us like, hey, I want to learn this. I want to learn this. And we're like, yeah, but we don't want to make it so wide that we lose our target audience. And we don't want to make it so small that we don't get anyone. But at the same time, we're like, we want to focus on kids. That's our main focus. If we try to focus on the adults, it's going to be harder on us because now we're trying to make content at an adult level, and we don't want to make it too easy where they're like, okay, this is like nonsense. This is for kids. So that was another thing. So I think for all of us, it's like, how can we all like, do something else outside of that? And I know for myself, I'm like, I want to start something for adults. So I might do that outside of Stacked Up because I want people to be able to learn at a higher level, even though I still would kind of teach at a lower level if they're beginners, but I still want them to be able to learn at a higher level. So that's something that I've been looking into, making like kind of like a crash course, like something like really like just introductory level. Because people say they want to learn or get into tech, and then they get into tech or they learn something like, I don't like this. This doesn't make sense. So I want people to understand like, I can teach you a 5-minute course and you'll see if you really like it. And if you don't, now you understand what you want to do, because don't say it because you see money or you see things like that and you're like, I want to get into this. And I also talk about understanding the field that you want to be in, because you might work for corporate but you really want to be in the music, or you want to be in fashion of technology. So what part of technology do you want to be in? So I also want to kind of get that within, in the adult learning, like what sector do you want to be in, because everyone is not going to fit in where they think they will just because they want to be in technology. So that's something I've been working on the side as well.
Yeah, great points. I think that you're targeting there related to the different kind of subheadings under tech in technology
Mhm.
because we all see like this big, grandiose kind of looming cloud thing that everybody falls underneath, and it's like, oh well, technology, yeah, great,
Mhm.
but where do you position yourself? Thinking about Stacked Up in particular, broad spectrum. I got some fun questions related to that. Imagine you had unlimited resources.
Mhm.
How would you expand the reach of Stacked Up, and what would that look like?
I think what's really big for me is being able to have product on hand. When we first launched, we it was kind of like a conversation, like a back and forth, like, yeah, let's print 100 stacks. And like, no, that's too many. People aren't gonna buy it. And it's like, no, let's do it. Two out of three were like, let's do 100 stacks. And then one was like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. But we outweighed it. So we printed 100 stacks and we sold one. So when we're in those spaces and we're like, okay, but why? And then we talked about why are we not selling enough? Because when we first launched, everybody was so excited about it. So we're like, of course they're gonna buy it. They're so excited about it. But then again, we forgot the why. Like, why are you buying this? You're buying this because this, that, and the third. So we lost that factor of like really hounding in on why people should get this. And I think that's where we were so focused on the product and let's focus on the why. And I think that what kind of stumped us a little bit. So understanding that part of thing, but for me, having unlimited product is still fine to me because even though it's not moving like we expected it to, it's still like, say if I want to do like a marketplace, it's like we recently applied to do a marketplace at Thanksgiving. I'm in December, so we got accepted into the marketplace. I'm like, well, we have all this product now, so we can use that here. So even though so things like that, so having that product on hand is just really important to me. So having unlimited resources, because sometimes you can't buy all that product because you don't know how it's going to move. You don't know if it's going to take you a year to sell it, or where you can be in those spaces where people are going to buy it. So kind of thinking about things like that and not wanting to do pre-orders, because I know how I feel. If I order something, I got to wait 4 weeks for it. I don't know if I want it anymore. I don't know how I'm going to feel about buying it. So I think that's something that would definitely, so having unlimited resources, also being able to just talk about it more, be in spaces where we could really explain what we're trying to do. Getting in those spaces, say, hey, just knocking on doors, like, I want to do this. And they're like, yes, like getting a yes, getting like, funding. We tried funding grants and different things like that and not being able to get to that space or getting into those spaces. So also being able to not worry about like focusing so hard on like the money aspect of it, and understanding like we're really trying to create like a solid product and making sure that this product is actually effective. And luckily the two of them do have younger kids. One has twins and one has a baby girl. And like, hey, we're just going to teach them it and see how they feel when they learn these words. Can they pronounce these words? Are these words too hard? Because again, within these pillars that we have, some words might be more difficult to pronounce, but still trying to keep it at a child level, but having it at a advanced level where they're talking about this in class and people are like, how do you know that? So different things like that as well. But I would say definitely being able to just have a bunch of product on hand and being able to go to those places and kind of showcase this product and ROI.
And so we have the technical aspect of it. We have design. We have financial literacy. Just curious, as another fun kind of question, if you were to branch into any other industry or field
Mhm.
to loop that into Stacked Up, like what would that be? Or like, have you thought about just
Mm,
what might
mhm,
that other, like, if they, what would be the next thing
mhm.
potentially that you would look at if that was a
Mm.
conversation?
And we were taking music and intertwining it to tech again. But it's like, okay, music, make a beat with Python or with music as well. You can use AI to, help you not write a whole song, but come up with like similes or anything like that for a song. If you just put a word and now you take that word and it gives you something back, and then you make something from that simile it gave you. So different things like that have been a thought too. Like, how can we expand? How can we make tech or just the company fun overall? And it's so many different things you could do. So I think that's been our main breaking point. Like, how can we make this so fun? Like, and I tell people all the time, even the students that I work with, the older students, and we're learning back end and different things. They're like, this back end stuff is boring. And I'm like, yeah, but tech, and I think people associate tech with boring too. Or like when people come to me and they're like, oh, you're so smart. And I'm like, I'm creative. That's what I am. So I'm like, that's what really drives me within tech, because the creativeness that you can have, not more so, oh, I'm so technically smart and all of this. So I think that's what something that we're also trying to hound in, like how much fun you can have within these job fields as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate the creative aspect of it because it's that's definitely a thing that, of course, we're thinking about traditional curriculum and that type of thing. This that gets kind of pushed to the side often, which is ultimately, I think it's pretty problematic when we start to look at how even again our young people are growing, developing, and then just the potential that they see in themselves might not necessarily be connected to their brilliance, which might be more creative. So if we don't tap into that, then of course later on, we kind of lose that. So I appreciate that. I got two more questions. One more related to kind of this same thought path. I think that we're walking right now, which is I'm interested to know if there was one thing that you really want people to understand about the work that you're doing, about Sacked Up and the importance of it, what would that one thing be?
I would say definitely really something about, like, I think a lot of people underestimate how important it is or how much it can help. And I think that's something that I would want to kind of put out. Like, don't think your kids don't need this, because they do. Like, they do. Like, it's no, whether they learn it through us or in the real world, especially with the finance, they need this. That's just, that's what it is. So I think that is something, because it's like, why would I buy it? What are they going to do? And it's like, no, they need this. They need this in some type of way. And is sometimes they might not always be dealing with their finances on hand. Like they might, hire a financial advisor or anything like that. But when they have those conversations with their financial advisor, they're going to be mentioning words and terms that if they have a lack of, now the financial advisor has to teach them also while they're having those conversations. So at least they're able to have that conversation and know exactly what they're speaking about, even though if they might not know how to manage it as well. So it's like they just need to know these things. So I think that's something that is definitely like, don't think they don't need this, because they do. And just seeing how people like evolve, and having grandparents and seeing how they interact with their phones, going from like different types of phones as well. Both of my grandmothers have iPhones, and them just having that learning curve and learning how to use it or things, or even going on like social media with it, like going on Facebook, going on Instagram, and they are kind of, beginners to it as well, because this is something that wasn't as popular. And then even for us in our generation, we didn't start off with iPhones. Like the computers, you couldn't take a computer outside the house. Like you had to being only time I was excited to go home to be on the computer, because it was home. Like I couldn't go to have my laptop. So different things like that, and seeing that transition of technology as well, and knowing that like they need to know how to use these things, because it's not only going to advance, but some certain things are going to disappear, and they have to have new learnings of that. And I think that's a big talk around AI as well. And a lot of people are scared of it, of taking over the world or whatever the case may be. But what we have with it right now, we need to use it to create what we can create, and then however else we adjust to it, we figure that out when it comes. But yeah, so I think that's just really important. Like they need these skills.
And that actually transitions really nicely into my last kind of formal question here, which is really thinking about future, and with what you've created, what you're producing, what you will produce going forward. What I'm interested to leave here for all the listeners and everybody tapping in is, for you, what legacy do you hope that your current work and just your life leaves behind when it comes to talking about the tech and AI space as we progress into the future?
Yeah. I think for sure, like I've had a lot of conversations within, me being an educator and me trying to transition within a space where I'm like, okay, maybe I do want to be a software developer, or maybe I do want to dive into something where I'm not teaching. And then I've had conversations with people and we talk, and they're like, maybe that's just your calling. Maybe that's where you're supposed to be, because you're trying to transition into these spaces, and it's hard for you to transition into different spaces, especially when people see education. It's like you're just in education. I'm like, but I'm teaching people to be developers, and people that I've taught are now developers. So why, when I try to transition to developer, it's more difficult, and like maybe that's just not the space you're supposed to be in. And then I have conversation with other educators who have been developers before and now they're educators, and they're like, it's a whole different sector. Like they enjoy the education part of it more. So also having those conversations with other people and understanding like what space fits best. And I think for me, just being the impact that I do definitely want to make, and just long term and so on, it's just being like an educational visionary overall within the tech space, especially for the younger generation, and being able to really see the impact that it makes, or like the skills that they're learning, and seeing that it has made an impact or a difference within their learning. As a high school teacher, I had one student that was just especially just really into the mobile app design class. Like he was just like always asking questions, helping people, so on. And but that was 2020. He graduated year 2020. He now works as like a data something at like Prudential. So to see that growth of even someone who's in those spaces is things that I want to continue to see, and kind of track that. So that's something that I definitely want to be able to bring to the future, just being that person who helped so many people get into that space and actually enjoy themselves while they're in that space. So making sure that I'm not just throwing them in there to say like, oh, this is like a great field to be in, but this is something I'm in, and this is something I enjoy that I'm in because of the direction that you gave me within what you kind of taught me of how to maneuver, or what space I should best be in when I enter that space, no matter if they're 4 and then I talk to them again when they're like 30. Like I want to see that transitional growth for them and seeing how that might be.
That's amazing. And well, there you have it. Shadeira, it's been amazing sitting down, talking with you, hearing about your background, the work that you're doing stacked up, and just consideration for your plans for leaving a legacy behind, especially in the education sector, building in tech, but also thinking about, you know, our community, our youth, and just globally where we can expand, and the importance behind a lot of the work that you've emphasized here. So tell us where we can follow you, socials, and also where we can interact with your business.
Yes, for sure. So Shadeira Nesmith on LinkedIn. Also within Stacked Up, we have stackedupacademy.com. We are also on LinkedIn and Instagram, the same name, Stacked Up Academy. And yeah, so connect with me there. I'm always on LinkedIn. So definitely reach out to me. I'll definitely can answer more questions. And yeah, and just being able to be a part of the community of Stacked Up would just be really awesome. So yes.
It's been a pleasure having you and
Thank you so
hearing about
much.
everything. And we wish you nothing but success in the future. For everybody that has joined us again, thank you. And if you are just now tuning in to Narrative, The Road to 100, make sure that you also go back and review any of the previous ones that we've completed and going forward until, of course, we get to that number of 100, and continue to support at blackaimedia.com and all of the resources and the things that we are producing, building, and sharing there. But without further ado, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome.
Peace
Thank
and
you.
love.